The 19th century, the end of the Georgian era and the long reign of Queen Victoria, long may she reign, saw a great deal of social and economic reform and change in Britain. In the early 19th century, very few people had the right to vote. A survey of 1780 revealed that the electorate in England and Wales consisted of just 214,000 people, fewer than 3% of the population of approximately 8 million. In Scotland, the electorate was even smaller. In 1831, so 50 years later, a mere 4,500 men out of a population of 2.6 million people were entitled to vote in parliamentary elections. Large industrial cities such as Leeds, Birmingham, Manchester, they didn't have a single MP to represent them, whereas rotten boroughs such as Dunwich in Suffolk, which in 1831 had a population of just 32, were still sending 2 MPs to Westminster. The British electoral system was unrepresentative and outdated. At least that appeared to be the case for the majority of the population. The majority of the disenfranchised population that had no political voice. And as you might perhaps expect, many of the moneyed political social elite disagreed. For them, the system was working exactly as intended. During the late 18th and the early 19th century, pressure for parliamentary reform grew sometimes very rapidly, and some of that pressure, some of the demand came from men who actually had a say or influence in how Britain was run. Country gentlemen angry about the use of patronage at Westminster, or the supremacy of the Lords over the Commons, or manufacturers and businessmen who were keen to marry political influence to match their economic power. Men with great wealth, but no votes, no political voice. However, the issue of parliamentary reform reached a much, much wider audience, particularly in the wake of the French Revolution. Influenced by works such as Thomas Paine's Right of Man, radical reformers demanded that all men be given the right to vote, and reform groups such as the Sheffield Correspondence Society, founded in December of 1791, and the London Correspondence Society, founded in January of the same year, were committed to universal manhood, that is, adult male, suffrage. 2 decades later, and the radical public speaker Henry Hunt spoke at numerous political meetings, all on that same theme. During August of 1819, at one such gathering in St. Peter's Field in Manchester, local yeomanry, at the orders of the magistrates, charged the crowd, killing at least 11 people and wounding hundreds more. After the incident, dubbed the Peterloo Massacre in radical circles, but in newspapers too, the government of course passed a series of electoral reforms, and no, they didn't. It was a series of repressive measures, and parliamentary reform was still a distant and blood-stained prospect. There were 3 great Parliamentary Reform Acts introduced in 19th century Britain, specifically in England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland having their own laws and their own government. They were introduced in 1832, in 1867 and 1884 respectively, and they satisfied the demands of moderate reformers but gave nothing to radicals. The Prime Minister in the 1830s, Lord Grey, supported reform to, quote, prevent the necessity of revolution, and he was responsible for the first, or the Great Reform Act of 1832. However, that act gave the vote in towns only to men who occupied property whose annual value was £10, which was a great deal of money. And this excluded 6 out of 7 adult males in the voting process, and at a stroke, disenfranchised the few women who already had the vote. The same year as the Great Reform Act in England, there was the Scottish Reform Act, an Act of Parliament introducing similar wide-ranging changes to the election laws in Scotland. Prior to the Act, only 0.2% of the population had a vote compared to a mighty 4% or so in England, which meant that the Scottish electorate soared overnight, going from about 4,500 or 5,000 of the population of 2.3 million to about 65,000, 13% of the adult men, which meant that voting in Scotland was no longer a private preserve for the very few rich family. However, it did not offer radical change to the method by which Scottish counties elected their MPs, and the number of Scottish MPs changed only very slightly from 45 to 53, which was against the trend in England and Wales where the number of MPs actually shrank. But the boroughs were changed. The Representation of the People Ireland Act of 1832, more commonly called the Irish Reform Act, was another. It's the third of these three great Reform Acts of 1832, and it also offered wide-ranging changes to the election laws of Ireland. However, whilst the number of Irish MPs did grow slightly from 100 to 105, the number of people that could vote was also increased only slightly. But it is worth mentioning that Catholics had only been allowed to stand as MPs in Ireland, in England and Wales and Scotland, from the passing of the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829. So this was not the first Victorian electoral reform for Ireland, but it was in many ways not as far-reaching as in Scotland or in England and Wales. Tory politician Lord Derby described the second Reform Act, the Reform Act of 1867, as a leap in the dark. And similar might be said for the Representation of the People Scotland Act of the following year. However, despite this great leap in the dark, it's another great reform, only 2 in every 5 Englishmen enjoyed the vote in 1870. Even the third Reform Act, the Representation of the People Act 1884, which enfranchised all male house owners in both rural and urban areas, added 6 million people to the voting registers in England and Wales, and it extended through to Scotland and Ireland as well, this one. But it fell some significant way short of introducing universal manhood suffering, although the size of the electorate was increased considerably, particularly from the beginning of the 19th century. All women and some 40% of male adults were without the vote. Male suffrage varied enormously from the kingdoms too. In England and Wales, 2 in 3 adult males had the vote. In Scotland, 3 in 5 did. In Ireland, the figure was about 1 in 2. The road these acts and these electoral reform took, however, was long and surprisingly bloody. We're going to call in at Peterloo and Merthyr and Tolpuddle and take in protest and riot and charter and petition as we go through these reform acts, and I really hope you're going to join me for some of those stops along the way.